Hello, my name is Adam and I'm with Chesapeake Search Dogs. Today we're going to go through and show you one of the really important pieces of search and rescue, really orienteering in general, and that is how to plot UTM coordinates onto a map and then determine the distance and the bearing between each of those. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is walk you through just a couple of pieces here on the map. Really important to make sure that your map is printed appropriately. And what I like to do to verify that is lay my grid reader, which I'll talk about here in a moment, in here, and just make sure that all of these numbers fit. So I want to make sure that 0 lines up with one of these grid lines, and then the 1 kilometer mark also lines up with the grid line, right? So make sure that we're zoomed appropriately on the paper. A couple of things to note, and one is the magnetic declination here. As we go through and calculate these, that's going to be very important, so we're going to bear in mind that that's 11. We can see all of our easting coordinates along the bottom. We can also see our northing coordinates along the side here, and you get that on both sides as well. Within that, of course, we have our major grid lines, which we can see those are very helpful to have. The next piece that I want to talk about, I'm actually going to flip this over so we have a nice white background, is our grid reader. So the grid reader is going to basically provide us with the ability to measure. Now, my grid reader is really nice. It does notate that up here is going to be 1 kilometer, right? So this 9 is really going to be 900, 800, and so forth on down. So I can see what those major numbers are, which means that each of these individual is going to be tens. So we'll keep that in mind as we go through. The other item that I want to introduce to you is, of course, the compass, right? And hopefully you've got some exposure to compasses at this point, but there's a couple of items that I want to talk about. One is really the plastic piece that holds all of this together, right? And we're going to call that the base plate, and that does come in handy because I do utilize the edges of the base plate throughout this. My base plate also happens to have some rulers here, which is can be handy, although, quite frankly, I don't really use them that often. We also have what's called the direction of travel indication, and that is, or direction of travel arrow, and that's always printed on the base plate. Then we also have the dial here, and the dial is going to be this piece that I'm able to spin. Within or on the dial here, you notice here that there is a white line that doesn't move as I turn, and that is going to be the index line. So that'll come in handy when I reference that. We also have the Orienting Arrow, which is this red arrow within the dial. You can see that is always basically going to point right at the north. Obviously, we have all of our various degrees around here, so we're going to be looking at those. We have the magnetic needle. The magnetic needle does not matter for this today, so don't let that magnetic needle trip you up. That's not going to matter. So the fact that I'm using a metal pen, it's not going to matter here. Within the dial, kind of parallel to what this orienting arrow is, are what's called Meridian Lines, and those come in really handy. So I like to make sure I'm using a compass that has those that are easy to read. So that's everything with the compass. So what we'll do is go ahead and get started. I'm going to go ahead and start with showing you kind of what my coordinates are. So I have here a list of coordinates that I want to plot. I'm not going to plot all of these on the video here, but you might be plotting quite a few. It's really important to note this is an 8-digit grid. Sometimes people are given the full UTM coordinates. Other times people are given a 10-digit grid, right? So on a 10-digit grid, this is actually going to give you 1 meter accuracy here, which is really nice for when you're using a GPS, but quite frankly, on a map, you're never going to get 1 meter accuracy. So I like to just go ahead and discount that last digit, right? Because we're going to really plot to 10 meters, which is going to be this next one in. So for 5499 1, I'm going to go ahead and just say, hey, you know what? I don't care about that 1. So we're going to be looking at plotting 5499. Over here, 72 80 29. Well, 29, that's really going to be right up next to 30. So again, I don't like to just cross this out because then I'm going to be 10 meters off. So I like to round that up. So I'm going to make that 7283. And of course, I said 5499, right? So I always round. I don't just cross that last one out. So that's going to be my first coordinate. So I'm going to flip my page back over here, and you can see that that's what I've written down at the top for my first point. All right, so first thing for plotting your points is to find where on this map you're going to be. And this is by far one of the more common mistakes that people make. And what people will do is they'll lay their grid reader down and they'll start measuring across in maybe this square here. Well, that's not the square I want to be in, right? So how do I find that? So let's look at the first 2 digits of my easting coordinate. That's going to be 54. So we're going to look down here at the bottom of my map. I'm going to say, okay, I found 54, right? So now I'm somewhere along this easting line, right? So now what I need to do is come over to my coordinate and say, okay, now I'm going to be looking at 7283. So let's focus on the 72. So I'm going to come up along my northing coordinates, and I'm going to find 72. So again, here's my that line that I'm going to be looking at. So it's going to be difficult to see this on here. Get everything within frame, right? So I have my 72, I have my 54 coming up, and I'm basically going to, I like to make a small mark in that grid, in the corner of that. So I know I'm going to be in this box. I'm going to slide my map over a little bit here, and actually going to slide my camera down as well. Slide my camera up, how about that? So I know that I'm going to be inside this grid, and it's really much easier to see here. I can see my 54, I see my 72, so this is going to be kind of the relevant corner here as I go through and do this. So I'm going to put that back into view. So we're going to grab our grid reader. Grid reader is used really for 2 things, and that's plotting the point as well as measuring the distances. So what I'll do is go ahead and lay that grid reader in this lower corner here. So again, that's my starting corner. So that 5400 by the 7200 is going to be that lower corner. So now we always start with our easting. So what I'll do is start sliding this over. I'm actually going to zoom in a little bit more. By zoom, I just mean slide my camera down. That way you can see pretty well in detail here. So I'm at that 0, 0. I'm going to just start sliding my grid reader over. And what I'm looking to do is match up this grid line with the 99 here on my grid reader. So as I slide that over, I'm going to go pretty much all the way to the end because 5499 is going to be right there. And I do want that parallel basically with the line I'm sliding along to be parallel with the grid line on my map. So now I'm going to focus on the 7283, right? I've got my easting correct. So now I need to go to northing. So slide my map down a little bit here, and I'm going to come all the way up. We're starting at 0. We're going to go to 83, right? So 83 is going to be a little tricky to do this on camera here. So I'm going to come up here and actually just slide this out of the way for a moment while I make that mark. Now, you pretty much always want to be doing this in pencil. I'm using a blue pen today because the blue actually does pop a little bit better on camera than what a pencil would. So again, I've got that. You can kind of see where I made that teeny tiny little mark. You want to make these marks as small as possible because the thickness of your mark does matter. I always use a mechanical pencil, and I always try to find the finest point mechanical pencil I can possibly find. So what I like to do is now circle that point because it's really easy to lose these dots, and I also label that. So that's going to be my start point, so I put a little S there. So now I've got my start point plotted. So I'm going to go ahead and come over here. We're going to plot another one. And so again, I've plotted this first one. So now we're going to be looking for 5479 by 7225. So again, the first thing we want to do, and you always want to go back and make sure of this, is that I'm in the right box. So if I position everything appropriately, I can see 54 here at the top, slide that down. I see 72 along here. So again, I'm in that same square that I was before. So I'm going to put my grid reader down into that corner. And I can see down here at the bottom of your screen, I can see that 0. And I'm going to start sliding over. And again, my coordinate is 5479. I'm working on that one. So I'm going to slide this over. I'm going to move my camera down a little bit more. Slide this over until I'm at that 5479. So again, that's going to be just before the 80, I'm going to stop right there. So again, looking at 70, that's 75 is that next major mark, and 4 more is going to give me 79. So now I'm going up to, 72.25. So we're going to come up here, so I'm at 2, and of course halfway between 2 and 3 there's another major mark, and I'm going to go ahead and make my dot right there. So again, you can see that dot. I'm going to go ahead and circle it again, and we're going to call that point 1, right? So I have my start point and point 1. Now what I'll go ahead and do is go ahead and plot one more point. So we're going to come up here, and hopefully you're getting the hang of this pretty quick. You can rewind and watch this over again. So I'm going to start with, again, my 54.44 by 72.33. So you got to find that box, looking at the 54, the 72, going through and finding that. So the 54.72, again, I'm in the same box, but it's always good to double check that because it's a really common mistake, is that folks will accidentally put themselves in the wrong box. So looking for 54.44. So again, just going to slide this over until I get that 44 lined up right here. So really looking very closely there. Make sure that I'm at 54.44, and now coming up to 72.33. So again, starting down here with this grid reader, there's my 3. So we're going to count up 3 little dots, and we're going to go ahead and make that point. So again, I like to circle it, put a little 2 there, tells me where I'm going. So now what we're going to do, that we've plotted a couple of points. Generally speaking, I go through and plot every single one of my points, but I'm not going to bore you to tears on that. And what I'll do is go through and measure the distance between each point. Now, some folks like to draw lines between the two. I do not generally do that, simply because then it makes it harder for me to see my points. But I'll go ahead and show you a couple of tricks with that before we're done here. So what I'm going to do is take my grid reader, and I like to use the side without the slot for this part, but it's all personal preference. And I'm going to line up my point here with this 0. Now you could use the slot if you wanted to, and line up with the other 0. It doesn't really matter either way. It's just all about personal preference, right? So this is actually, on this particular grid reader, is a little bit easier to read, to do it that way. So we'll go ahead and do that. And so I'll line that up just perfectly like that. And again, I'm finding my point 1, and I like this grid reader because it's transparent, so I can see that point 1 there. So we're just going to double check, make sure the point is even with the 0 line, and then we're going to come up here and say, okay, well, where are we at there? And that's going to be at about, oh gosh, we'll call that 600 and maybe 20. So basically 6, and I see 1 little line and 2 little lines, so I'm going to call that 620 meters. So I'm going to write down 620, and this is where, having a magnifying glass is really handy. And really having small points that are going to be easy to see are going to be really important here. So that's my distance. I'm going to go ahead and, since I'm here, measure the distance between the next 2 points as well. Measuring distance, to me, is the easiest part of this process. So again, I'm taking point 1 here, making sure it's even with 0. I'm going to come up here, and that looks like it's about 350. One of the things to notice here is the size of that dot. If you look, it's really about 10 meters in size, right? So you're never going to be exact on these, and if you are, you're quite skilled at this. So I'm going to go ahead and call that 350. If you look, maybe that's kind of partway in between those 2 lines, so maybe we could write 355 there. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, write 355, and that's going to be that distance, basically from this point to this point. So now it's time for us to get the compass out and go ahead and measure what my bearing is going to be. So again, we have my compass here. What's really, really important here is this direction of travel here. So if I line this up like so, to go ahead and find out what bearing to go from my start point to point 1, I'm moving that direction. My arrow is currently pointing that direction. That's another really common mistake that people make, right? So I want to flip this around. This is the right way. This is the direction that I'm going to travel. So I know from here to here, I want to make sure that arrow is lined up. Now, folks do this a couple of different ways. Some folks will put them inside the direction of travel arrow. I find that very challenging personally, so I'm not going to do that. But what I will do is go ahead and line up the 2 points with the side of my base plate. And I like to have them just kind of off the base plate like that. And now I'm going to take my dial and I'm going to spin my dial. So I have my compass or my map oriented north, right? So I'm going to spin my dial around and basically point my orienting arrow north. Now this is where the meridian lines come in. I'm going to use my pen to point. If you remember, the meridian lines are these lines inside the dial. So right now I can see the grid, map grid is along here, and the meridian line's just kind of inside that. And I can see that those two are parallel. A lot of times it's handy to go ahead and slide the compass up and down. And again, you still want to make sure that those 2 points are even with the base plate. But now I can see, hey, my meridian line's pretty much right up on top of my grid line. So I can rotate a little bit and make sure that I am just right spot on. So I'm going to go ahead and call that pretty much spot on. So now that I have my dial set in that direction, I'm going to look at my index line. Now you notice my index line is right on 200. So that's super handy. So what I like to do is come over here and say, okay, I'm going to go 200 degrees. Now that is going to be the true bearing, right? We talked about earlier that I have some magnetic declination. And here in this part of Maryland, it's at 11 degrees. So what I'm going to do is put a plus sign, put 11 degrees, and that's actually going to be 211 degrees. So this is my magnetic bearing. So that's my magnetic bearing. So now I know when I'm standing in between these two ponds and I need to get up to that saddle, then I need to go 620 meters at 211 degrees, according to my compass, right? So again, that's how that's going to work. So let's go ahead and double check ourselves. So this is something I always do. It's kind of an overall kind of gut check on this. If I'm looking at my map, and again, I'm oriented north, and I'm going from this point to this point, roughly what cardinal direction am I going? So I'm roughly going to go south. Obviously, it's a little bit south-southwest. So what I like to do is go through here and say, okay, on my compass, north is 0 or 360 degrees. South is 180. So I know I'm going to be pretty close to 180, but a little bit higher. So again, 211 degrees makes perfect sense that would be roughly that direction of travel. So we're going to go ahead and measure the bearing between point 1 and point 2. So again, I'm going to lay my compass right across. Hopefully you guys are seeing this okay. And I'm going to spin my dial until my meridian lines are in line with my grid. So I'm going to go ahead and slide this over, just double check my points. And again, I can basically see, and I like to use, right now I'm using this kind of westmost, for lack of a better term, meridian line, and that is even with the grid. So now I can take my compass and move everything around here. Now I can see that I'm about 284, 285 or so there. So I'm going to go ahead and write down 285 on my piece of paper. And I could do the mental math here, but I always write it out because that way I don't have to go back later and say, hey, did I remember to add my declination? I know for a fact, looking at my paper, oh, yep, I showed my work. I can see that I went ahead and do that. So I can see I'm going to go roughly 296 degrees magnetic. So again, here's what I always do. I always want to double check myself. So to go from point 1 to point 2, roughly what cardinal direction am I going to go? And it's roughly going to be west. Well, I know from my experience that west is 270 degrees. So I know I ought to be a little bit off from 270, but I shouldn't be at, 310, right? So again, that's where I want to be. And I can see there that I'm going to be at 285 and then 296. So it's really important to do that because every once in a while you'll accidentally hold your direction of travel wrong. So if I'm off 180 degrees from where I think I'm supposed to be, that way I know, okay, well, it's not 100 degrees, it's almost 300, right? So we can go through and do that. So that's really, really important. I'm going to plot one more point here since I have another one to plot, and go ahead and do this again somewhat quickly with you. Hopefully you're catching all this. If not, you can go through and rewind it again or leave a comment on the video and say, hey, you're not really making any sense. So what we're going to do is look, again, 5485 by 7162. And now I kind of probably beating a dead horse here, but we want to make sure that we're in the right grid, right? So let's come up to the top here. And we've got our 54 line, and we've got, I'm going to slide the paper down, we've got our 71 line. Right, so we're in a different grid than we were before. And this is a huge, as I mentioned before, a huge area where somebody might make a mistake. So I'm in a different box. If I were to measure up in this box, where I was before, I'm going to be really off. So what we'll do is come up here and put the grid reader in that lower corner of this grid that I'm in. Again, that 71 grid, the 54 coming down. I'll put that 0, 0, 0. And I'm going to go ahead and slide on across to 5485. So we'll go ahead and slide all of this over. Put my 5485 there. And now my other coordinate is 7162. So I'm going to come up here to 6, and I said 62, and I'm going to make a small dot right there about that 62 mark. I'm a little off there, but again, that's the nice thing about using a pencil and not a pen, is I could erase and do that again. I've got a really large dot there, but I can see that I'm right smack in the middle of this drainage, right? So again, going to circle it, put a number 3 there, because that is my third point. I've got my start point, point 1, point 2, point 3. So we'll go through and go ahead and measure this. Now this one's going to be challenging to measure because we're going to be pretty close to 1,000 meters, but it looks like we're inside that 1,000 meters, so that's handy. It's always challenging when you're over 1,000 meters. Hopefully you're not navigating with the compass over 1,000 meters, because that is a bit of a challenge here. So what I'll do is go ahead and line that up. Okay, so I'm at that. Well, I'm going to put this down here. And direction of travel doesn't matter because it's just true distance. So I'm going to make sure that my 0 is in here. And it looks like I'm about a little above that 900 mark. So I'm going to go ahead and write down 910 meters here. 910 meters. So now let's grab our compass. And again, direction of travel is important on with the compass. So I have my, whoops, moved my whole camera stand. So I have my second point, my third point. I'm going to lay my compass across that. Let's go ahead and move this down so that we can see everything that we're doing here. Now, so I have my direction of travel arrow pointed in the right direction. We're going to spin this, and again, you got to make sure not only is your direction of travel arrow done, but this is always oriented north with your map, right? So I'm going to go ahead and actually slide this down. It doesn't matter which direction I line that up with, or at least what side of the base plate I'm on. And the reason why I'm sliding that over is so that I can get my meridian lines of my compass in line with a grid. So it's just kind of, tweaking it, make a couple of settings or position changes here, and now I can see my meridian lines in line with my grid line, and I still have my 2 points along the base plate. So now that I have that, I can spin this compass around here, and I can go through and see, okay, I'm about 154 degrees here. So I've got my 150 line, and each of these is 2, so I'm going to go ahead and call that 154 degrees. So I grab my piece of paper here, right, 154 degrees. Now again, we're going to add the declination. I'm going to go ahead and gut check this, right? So I know that I'm going to be moving in somewhat of a southeast direction. So I'm going to be less than 180, but obviously way above 90 here. So being at 154 seems to make sense. I'm going to add my 11 degrees here. I don't know why my brain just stopped working and I couldn't do simple arithmetic. So I'm going to be at 165 degrees magnetic. So again, that's going to be the whole process. That's plotting the points, that's measuring your distance, as well as that's measuring the bearing. Now, one of the things that I said I wanted to talk about was really drawing the lines in between the two. So a lot of folks like to draw these lines. Now, the problem that I see with drawing lines is that now I don't know exactly where my dots are. So I'm going to go ahead and draw a line here between these points. And again, I like to use the edge of the compass as the ruler. So let's go ahead and draw that line. So what I do when I do decide to draw lines is I start right at the point and I stop right at the point. If you overshoot that, then you have no idea where the dot is, right? So that's a really important thing. The other item that I do when I'm doing lines is I make a direction of travel arrow. And I want to do it right at the tip there because, again, that's my point and that's my point. So what I do is at about midway, I make two little hash marks. So I know that I'm going from point 1 to point 2, so now I kind of have a little arrow there. So again, that's the other way. The problem with that is potentially losing those points. It does make lining up your compass much easier, but it makes measuring the distances a little bit harder. And that's why I don't do it, is because I find that a little bit more challenging on measuring the distance, just in case, my hand slips and I overshoot that. So again, that is entirely personal preference, but just kind of walking you through the way that I do it. It also somewhat can mask the different land features that are on your map. Well, I hope that's helpful. We'll hopefully put together some other videos in the future on some different techniques with this. And with that, we'll leave you